In the winter of 1942, somewhere between two frozen lakes in northern Russia, a column of German armored vehicles sat motionless on a forest road. Their engines had ceased, not because of enemy fire, not because of mechanical failure in the traditional sense, but because the lubricant inside the transmissions had turned to paste. The temperature had dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the spare parts needed to fix these machines was sitting in a warehouse hundreds of kilometers away. Cataloged under the wrong supply category, these were tanks, but the bureaucracy responsible for keeping them running was designed to maintain airplanes. This is the story of a military formation built on a contradiction so fundamental that it shaped every single day of its operational existence. A ground combat division, fielding tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry that belonged not to the Army, but to the Air Force. Be honest, if you were a soldier assigned to a unit whose very supply chain was designed for a completely different kind of war, would you trust the system to keep you alive? And here is another question worth sitting with. Can an organization built on political loyalty ever truly transform itself into a professional fighting force? Or does the original sin of its creation follow it forever? Let's find out. The unit in question carried one of the most recognizable names of the Second World War, not because of what it achieved, but because of who created it. To understand why this division fought the way it fought, why it suffered the way it suffered, and why its story reveals something deeply structural about how wars are actually sustained, we need to go back to the very beginning, not to a battlefield, but to a political office in Berlin. The year is 1933. Germany is in the earliest phase of a political transformation that will reshape the continent, and a newly appointed minister, freshly installed as the head of internal security for the state of Prussia, decides he needs a personal security force, not a military regiment in the traditional sense, something closer to an armed political instrument, a unit whose first qualification for membership is not combat experience, but ideological reliability. This is the seed from which everything else grows. The original formation is small. A few hundred men organized along the lines of a motorized police detachment. Their equipment is rudimentary. Civilian vehicles modified for paramilitary use. Standard personal weapons. No heavy armament. No armor. No artillery. Their mission profile resembles that of an elite gendarmerie, not a combat formation. They guard government buildings. They provide security at political events. They execute tasks that fall somewhere between policing and political enforcement. The recruitment criteria tell you everything about the unit's DNA in this period. Political background and institutional loyalty rank above verifiable military skill. The result is a formation with high internal cohesion of a very specific kind. Cohesion built on shared political identity rather than shared tactical competence. This distinction matters enormously because it creates a tension that will persist for years. The gap between political solidarity and military professionalism is not a gap that closes automatically. It requires deliberate effort, institutional reform, and above all, time. The first major structural transformation occurs in 1935. The minister who created this unit has accumulated a new and far more powerful position. He now commands an entirely new branch of the armed forces, the National Air Force, and in a decision that will generate consequences for the next decade, he absorbs his personal ground unit into the organizational structure of that Air Force. Stop and consider what this means in practical terms. A formation that walks on the ground, that fights with rifles and machine guns, that will eventually field tanks and heavy artillery, now reports through a chain of command built entirely around aerial operations. Its supply requests will be processed by logistics officers trained to manage aviation fuel and aircraft engine parts. Its personnel replacements will be allocated through a manpower system designed for aircrew and ground support staff. Its operational priorities will be evaluated by a headquarters whose primary concern is the air war, not the ground war. No other major belligerent in the Second World War created an equivalent anomaly. Every other nation kept its ground combat divisions under Army command, supplied through Army logistics channels, and evaluated by Army operational standards. This formation existed in a category of one. and that category would prove to be a trap. The mid and late 1930s bring gradual professionalization. Anti-aircraft artillery batteries are incorporated, and these will eventually become the unit's most distinctive combat capability. Officers with genuine military training begin filtering into the command structure. Veterans of the previous war, graduates of established military academies. The original police-style mission fades as the combat mission expands, but the professionalization is incomplete and uneven. Senior command positions remain influenced by personal and political networks rather than strict meritocratic selection. The doctrine the unit follows is still evolving, borrowing elements from standard Army practice, but not yet developing a coherent tactical identity of its own. When war begins in September 1939, the unit participates in the campaign against Poland in a secondary role. Security tasks, rear area protection, no integration with the armored spearheads executing the deep penetration maneuvers that defined the campaign. The following year, during the campaign in Western Europe, the pattern repeats. Marginal participation, second echelon employment, observers from the Army who interact with the unit. During this period, note two things. First, the quality of its anti-aircraft artillery and motorized transport is genuinely impressive. Second, its command cadre lacks experience in combined arms coordination at the battalion and regimental level. They can move efficiently, they can shoot accurately, but orchestrating the simultaneous employment of infantry, artillery, and armor in a fluid tactical situation is a skill they have not yet developed. The Balkans campaign of 1941 provides the first real crucible. Varied terrain, active combat against a resisting enemy, situations that demand improvisation and tactical adaptation. The experience catalyzes a decision that will define the unit's trajectory for the remainder of the war. It will be expanded into a first-line combat formation. The timing coincides with the preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. By June 1941, the unit has grown to brigade strength, significantly more infantry, better vehicles, but still no tank battalion. It remains, in essence, a motorized formation with heavy anti-aircraft guns, and it is this configuration, a formation without its own organic armor, but with extraordinary anti-aircraft firepower, that first encounters the realities of the Eastern Front. What happens next involves a weapon system that deserves specific attention. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun was not designed to destroy tanks. It was designed to destroy aircraft at high altitude, but the physics of its ammunition made it devastatingly effective against armored vehicles. The standard armor-piercing round left a barrel at approximately 820 meters per second. At a range of 1,000 meters, it could penetrate more than 100 millimeters of homogeneous steel plate. In 1941, no Soviet tank in operational service could withstand that impact at any practical combat range. Not the T-34, which shocked German crews with its sloped armor and wide tracks. Not the KV-1, which was nearly impervious to standard German anti-tank guns. Against the 88, both were vulnerable. The division did not invent the concept of using this weapon against ground targets, but it developed a particularly systematic method of integrating 88mm batteries into its tactical formations. The guns were positioned at the edges of tree lines, where natural cover provided concealment while still allowing fields of fire across the likely avenues of enemy approach. The engagement ranges were devastating. Soviet tanks advancing across open ground toward a concealed 88 battery were being destroyed at distances where they could not effectively return fire. But the system had a critical weakness. Weight. The gun with its cruciform platform exceeded 5,000 kilograms in firing position. Moving it required a dedicated half-track tractor. Displacing from a position under pressure was slow and dangerous. If the tactical situation deteriorated rapidly, the guns could become stranded. And the stranded 88 was not just a lost weapon. It was a catastrophe, because the entire defensive scheme depended on its firepower. Here's where I want to pause and ask you something. Imagine you are a battery commander. You have 4 of these guns positioned in a tree line. You can see enemy tanks forming up for an attack 1,500 meters away. You know your guns can destroy them, But you also know that if the infantry on your flanks gives way, you will not be able to move your guns fast enough to avoid being overrun. Do you stay and fight, trusting that the infantry will hold? Or do you begin displacing now, sacrificing the advantage of your current position to preserve the guns for the next engagement? This is not a hypothetical question. It is the kind of decision that battery commanders in this division faced repeatedly in the forests and marshlands between Lakes Ladoga and Ilmen. The operational system that governed how the division fought was built around a concept of flexible task organization, rather than fighting as a fixed formation with a permanent structure. The division assembled temporary combat groups tailored to specific missions. A typical group might include 1 or 2 motorized infantry battalions mounted in half-tracks, several 88mm batteries configured for anti-tank work, a company of combat engineers with bridging equipment, armored reconnaissance vehicles, and a communications detachment with radio sets capable of maintaining contact across the dense forest terrain. This system offered remarkable tactical flexibility. A group could be assembled in hours, deployed to a crisis point, and dissolved once the immediate threat was contained. But the flexibility came at a cost. Each group had unique supply requirements. Coordinating the simultaneous delivery of fuel, multiple calibers of ammunition, and spare parts for formations of varying composition multiplied the administrative burden on a headquarters staff that was already operating under structural constraints. And those structural constraints were severe. The supply chain ran through Air Force logistics channels, depots managed by Air Force personnel, priority systems calibrated for Air Force needs. When the division needed thousands of 88mm anti-tank rounds per week of active combat, the request entered a bureaucratic pipeline that did not recognize ground ammunition consumption as a primary category. When tank engines needed replacement, the requisition competed with demands for aircraft engine components in a system where aviation material held structural priority. The terrain in the lake sectors compounded every logistical difficulty. This was not the open steppe of southern Russia, where armored formations could maneuver freely. Between Ladoga and Ilmen, the landscape was dense coniferous forest interspersed with extensive marshland, rivers of variable flow, and peat bogs that could swallow a 3-ton truck to its axles. The lakes themselves, Ladoga covering more than 17,000 square kilometers, and Ilmen fluctuating with the seasons, created narrow corridors that channeled all movement onto predictable axes. For the attacker, this was a nightmare. Massing forces for a breakthrough meant compressing them into corridors where defensive fire could be concentrated with devastating effect. For the defender, it was an equalizer. Numerical superiority mattered less when the terrain physically prevented the attacker from deploying that superiority across a broad front. But defense in this environment had its own brutal arithmetic. Supply routes were limited to forest tracks with marginal load-bearing capacity. During the spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, these tracks dissolved into channels of mud that immobilized wheeled vehicles completely. The division's transport trucks, primarily 3-ton models, designed for roads, not swamps, became liabilities rather than assets during these periods. Unlike standard Army infantry divisions, which maintained horses and animal-drawn transport as a backup, this fully motorized formation had virtually no animal traction capability. When the roads failed, everything stopped. Winter imposed a different, but equally systematic degradation. Vehicle engines required extended warming procedures before they could start reliably. On the coldest nights, engines were left running continuously to prevent the engine blocks from cracking, consuming fuel without producing any useful movement. Standard summer-grade lubricant solidified, causing accelerated wear on transmissions and gearboxes. Machine gun mechanisms froze. Tire rubber cracked from thermal contraction. Every weapon system in the division's inventory experienced performance degradation that advanced faster than the maintenance echelon could compensate. The field workshops operated under conditions that would be considered impossible in any normal industrial context. Replacing a tank engine requires lifting equipment, specialized tools, and a controlled environment. On the Eastern Front in winter, it meant working outdoors on frozen ground, with bare hands on metal surfaces cold enough to cause instant frostbite. using improvised lifting arrangements because the ground was too hard to anchor standard equipment. A major repair that would take 2 days in a proper workshop consumed a week or more in the field. The result was a growing accumulation of immobilized vehicles that could neither fight nor be evacuated. The operational readiness rates tell the real story. In an armored division under satisfactory logistical conditions, roughly 75 to 80% of assigned vehicles would be operationally available at any given time. In active combat sectors on the Eastern Front, that figure routinely dropped below 50%. During periods of high-intensity fighting, it could fall to 30% or lower. For this division, with its Air Force supply chain adding an additional layer of friction to every maintenance and resupply cycle, the figures were almost certainly worse than the Army average. As 1942 progressed into 1943, the division received its tank battalions, models equipped with long-barreled guns capable of engaging Soviet armor at meaningful ranges. The upgrade was significant, but integrating tanks into a formation that had spent its entire operational history fighting as motorized infantry, supported by anti-aircraft guns, created doctrinal friction. Battalion commanders trained in infantry-artillery coordination had to learn entirely new procedures for working with armored formations and dynamic contact. The Eastern Front offered very little time, collective training, units learned by fighting, and the tuition was paid in casualties. The division's role evolved into something that German operational terminology described with a grimly appropriate metaphor. It became a fire brigade, a mobile reserve shuttled from one crisis point to another, arriving wherever the front threatened to collapse, deploying its combat groups to seal breaches, contain penetrations, and by time for the operational level headquarters to organize a more permanent response. This role made perfect tactical sense. A fully motorized unit with concentrated anti-tank firepower and flexible task organization was precisely the instrument needed for rapid crisis response. But the role carried a hidden and cumulative cost. A unit in constant motion between crisis points never has the stability needed for systematic maintenance, orderly personnel rotation, or deliberate resupply. Each emergency deployment consumed resources. Combat power bled away with each engagement, and the replenishment cycle never ran fast enough to fully restore what was spent. In the Ladoga sector, elements of the division fought during Soviet operations aimed at establishing a land corridor to the besieged city to the northwest. Operations conducted with massed infantry along the lake margins, where the terrain compressed both attacker and defender into narrow killing zones. In the Ilmen sector, the division intervened in fighting around Soviet bridgeheads on river crossings, positions the opposing force sought to expand in order to isolate German formations in the advanced sectors of the Northern Front. In each case, the pattern was the same: a rival with whatever combat groups could be constituted from available resources, deployment of 88mm batteries into anti-tank positions along probable axes of advance, establishment of defensive sectors within the broader framework of elastic defense, absorption of attacks by formations that almost always held significant numerical superiority. The elastic defense system itself was a sophisticated doctrinal response to the realities of the Eastern Front after 1942. It was not a continuous line of trenches. It was an articulated system organized in depth, a forward contact zone with light forces whose mission was to detect, channel, and attrit the attacker before reaching the main defensive position. A main resistance zone where the real firepower was concentrated, and a mobile reserve constituted as a combat group capable of executing local counterattacks to recover ground that had been temporarily ceded. In the lake sectors, where terrain naturally channeled Soviet advances into predictable corridors. This system achieved results that raw force ratios would not have predicted. The attacker's numerical advantage was partially negated by the physical impossibility of deploying that advantage across a broad front. But the system demanded resources, above all ammunition, fuel, and functioning vehicles, and the supply system's structural deficiencies meant that those resources were never available in sufficient quantity for sustained operations. The trajectory of this division on the Eastern Front leads to a conclusion that can be stated in purely analytical terms. The formation achieved a level of tactical effectiveness that was remarkable given the chronic logistical friction under which it operated. Its anti-aircraft guns, repurposed as anti-tank weapons, provided firepower consistently exceeded what equivalent army formations could concentrate. Its task organization system delivered flexibility that proved invaluable in crisis situations. Its motorization provided mobility that made it genuinely useful as an operational reserve. But none of these tactical qualities could alter the fundamental equation of the Eastern Front. The industrial and demographic balance shifted progressively and irreversibly against the German forces. No single division, regardless of its tactical proficiency, could reverse a strategic trajectory driven by factors operating at a scale far beyond the reach of any local solution. The institutional anomaly that defined this division from its creation, a ground combat force under Air Force command, generated friction that was never resolved. Every supply request that had to navigate an aviation-oriented bureaucracy, every spare part requisition that competed with aircraft component demands, every personnel replacement that was allocated through a manpower system calibrated for aircrew rather than tank crews, represented a small but real reduction in combat capability, multiplied across thousands of transactions over years of continuous operations. These small frictions accumulated into a structural disadvantage that no amount of tactical skill could fully overcome. The story of this division is ultimately not a story about heroism or failure. It is a story about systems, about what happens when an organization is built on a structural contradiction and then asked to perform at the highest level under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The soldiers and officers within the system adapted, improvised, and fought with considerable skill. But the system itself, the supply chain, command relationships, the bureaucratic architecture, worked against them every single day. And perhaps that is the most important lesson embedded in this history. In war, tactical excellence is necessary but not sufficient. The system behind the fighting force, the logistics, command structure, the institutional framework, determines the upper limit of what tactical excellence can achieve. When that system is fundamentally flawed, even the most capable units operate under a ceiling they can never break through. The frozen trucks between the lakes, the guns waiting for ammunition that was cataloged under the wrong category, the tanks immobilized for want of parts that existed in warehouses but could not be delivered through the right channels. These are not dramatic moments of battlefield crisis. They are the quiet, relentless erosion of capability by institutional dysfunction. And in the long accounting of war, that erosion is often more decisive than any single battle. What remains, then, is a question not about this particular division, but about any organization that carries the weight of a flawed origin. Can a system designed for one purpose ever fully succeed when repurposed for another? Or does the original architecture always, eventually impose its limits? That is something we're thinking about, not just in the context of war, but in any context where the structures we inherit shape the outcomes we can achieve, whether we recognize their influence or not. Some of you are already subscribed. Thank you, genuinely. If you are not yet, this is your sign. Join us. There is much more coming.